Morning, everyone. So today we're moving into sort of a mini-series this week and next week, looking at the topic of dealing with change. And today is going to be about embracing change with faith. And we're doing these this short series because we're about to sort of launch the new vision in a couple of weeks' time. Going to move into a preaching series which will help teach the new vision. And with all this will be coming sort of time, I guess, of transition and change. Exactly what the changes are still fully to be decided. And some changes will be bigger changes, some changes will be smaller changes. And how we respond to change is, it's very different with each individual. For a lot of people, most of humanity, change is something that brings time of anxiety, a time of worry. We're not naturally people who deal with change very well. That's just the state of being human. But then, whilst we may have anxiety about change, there's be people who will want change and be really keen for things to change a lot and quickly. And what the season will be going through will be going too slowly for them, won't change enough for them. And then you'll have people on the other extreme where every change will be a bit too much, a bit too quick, a bit too dramatic. And then you'll get people who are sort of in the middle, quite happy with change, maybe don't even notice the changes, and so on. But we're about to go through a season where we're going to start maybe looking at doing things a little bit differently. And so it's good just to think about how we deal with change, how we look ahead, how we move forward with that in this new season. And I'm not planning on sort of huge, I don't think they're going to be huge things quickly, but maybe for some of you they will be huge things quickly. It depends on our own perceptions. But as we move into this new vision, we've had sort of, since I've been here, I'd say, I was told off at PCC because I was like, we've not really done much since I've been here because we've not made huge changes. But then we have done there's been a lot gone on in the last year, a lot of new things and things that have gone well, messy church, house groups and more. But actually, we've been a fairly steady time since I've been here. And now it's sort of maybe a time where things are going to be stirred up a little bit. And so it's good to look at this, and to do this, we're going to focus really on that very short Isaiah reading. Forget the former things, do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up, do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. It's a great little verse. You've probably seen it on postcards and Christian artwork, and people like to quote it. And then if you ever follow social media and sort of memes that come up, memes are like pictures which are meant to be funny, just in case you don't know what a meme is, which use this verse and talk about how people quote this verse, but they're not people who are Israel sat in exile in Babylon waiting to be set free, because we like to take it out of context and apply it, which is a good thing to do. We should be applying it to ourselves, but we forget that there's a context to it as well. But it's a good passage for us as we look towards change. And so we'll begin that first verse. Forget the former things, do not dwell on the past. So in its context, this is spoken to Israel in Babylon. And for Israel, so much of who they were and the stories they would share would be about the sort of glorious events of the past where God has saved the people of Israel. And just before these verses, there's a reminder about the Exodus where Israel were freed from Egypt and the glorious work that God did through the plagues, through getting them through the Red Sea into the wilderness, kept them safe through the wilderness and into the promised land. It was a huge, dramatic event, and the details of which were always retold, always remembered. But what had happened is that these details become a bit of a straitjacket. They started to sort of box God in their minds. God had to work in the way that he had done in the past. If God was going to save them from Babylon, it was going to be in the way he saved them from Egypt. And this was sort of a perception that was going on. And as a result, it meant that the people of Israel weren't really able to recognize God's new actions. They weren't realizing that God was at work around them and that he might be doing a new thing. And to quote a commentary on this, it says, "If we make an idol of the methods, we damn the very thing we should be blessing." And this was what he was saying in regards to Israel in this moment. They had become so sort of caught up in the methods that God might use to save them, the methods of how things are done, that actually they've forgotten about the fact that it wasn't really about what was done, but it was about the one who was doing it. It was about God. In their remembering of the past, it should have been about glorifying God and not the events that happened. So they had forgotten the one who was providing a blessing. They forgot what the blessing really was and were just going back to the things as they were and wanting the things of the past. And now this instruction to forget the former things, it's not an instruction to literally forget what God has done. And for Israel, he wasn't saying to them, well, forget about the Exodus, forget about all that of that, and and literally think, oh, well, what did happen? He wasn't saying to do that. But because, one example is Israel was still instructed, and the people were still instructed really to be celebrating Passover as they continue to do. And in Passover, it's very much the core of that celebration is about remembering what God has done for his people. And so it wasn't a literal forget, but it's about don't hold on to these things of the past. It's almost like you've forgotten it. There's going to be even better things to come. Enjoy them and don't hold on to them. Because the tendency was to see what God has done before and think that it has to be the same again. They were captive in Babylon, and God is promising a miraculous delivery of the people of Israel once again. And that would be invoking these memories of Exodus gone past. And so saying, forget those former things. Yes, I'm promising I'm going to bring you out of Babylon back into Jerusalem. But don't think it's going to be what was done before. It's going to be something new. And if they were going to keep thinking the way that they were, then they will not perceive God's work amongst them. They were not going to perceive the beauty of the glory of God. There will be a new Exodus, but it's not going to be the same. And actually, this promise of the new Exodus, as it were, the promises of these new things that was going to happen, it actually was going to look beyond just Babylon as well. These promises, and they continue through Isaiah, and they continue in later on, like Isaiah 53, the passage about the suffering servant, that comes after this passage. They are pointing towards something even greater than the return to Jerusalem. They're pointing towards the Messiah. They're pointing towards Jesus Christ, a greater exodus that is found in him. A completely new thing that God has done. Jesus was not the warrior king as expected. That's what the things of the past would have pointed towards. And say the triumphal entry of Jesus entering into Jerusalem, of a king who came in on a donkey very humbly, whereas historically, and it would have been in the minds of the people, kings who were arriving in a town, certainly if they were going to be the conquerors of the town, they'd arrive with great pageantry, with great triumph. They would have their armies go before them. They'd have trumpeters, drummers and more go ahead. And it would be a bit like a parade, really. Whereas Jesus did the opposite. He was doing a new thing. It was not going to be what was expected. The king who was going to save his people was going to be the one who suffered and died on the cross. God was doing a new thing. And so it is for us today. We can find ourselves really like Israel in this moment where we know God's going to work. We know that God is at work in the world, in our lives. But we limit God to the former things, expecting God to move in the same way as he has done in the past. We expect God, maybe we've had great ministries in this church, and we expect God to do the same thing again. We've always done this great I don't know, youth ministry. And we did it in this way. We had football, we had snooker, whatever else. That's what worked. That's what the youth wanted. And it was great. We were filled with youth in our church. And now we haven't got that. And we want to get youth. So what do? Oh, I know. Let's set up a youth group. We'll play football. We'll have snooker. We'll have all these other things like we did in the past. Because that's what was great. And yet, that may not be the way God is going to move amongst us. We think the things that have been are the things that should come again. And in doing so, we limit how God might work in our midst. And so if we are to be embracing change with faith, we need to forget the former things in the sense of we need to not hold on to the methods of the past and the details of what happened, but remember the one who caused the great things to happen. We don't have to do it exactly the same way because we still have the same God. The God who was the one who brought the fruit of that ministry. He's the one who's going to bring the fruit to a new ministry as well. He may not be calling us to do what we did 20, 30 years ago in the church, where the church, may have been full. He's not calling us to do those things. He's calling us to be the church, to be St. Michael's in the parish of Norton in the year 2024, where we're not quite as young maybe as we used to be, where we're not as large in number as we used to be. And we're in a time where society has moved on, where most of the people my age probably don't really know much about Christianity at all. I remember doing a alpha with they were baptism family, so people my age, and we sat down, and they didn't even know that the Bible had a New Testament and an Old Testament. That's the level we're speaking at, whereas 20, 30 years ago, everybody would have known that. And so we've got to be doing it differently if we're wanting to engage them with the Scripture, because they're at a different level to where we were. Technology has moved on from 20, 30 years ago. Everything, society has moved on, and so it's going to be a new thing. Again, to go to use the youth group example, I don't know why I've honed in on the youth groups, but to use the youth group example, youth groups 20, 30 years ago, I mean, I was in a youth group probably about 20 years ago now, it's a bit depressing, isn't it? But, they were quite different to what a youth group might be today. Like, we used to just love playing football. We used to play games. We used to have a game called Sock Wars, where we would basically fight each other and take each other's socks off, and the winner was the one who had the socks left last. But it used to get quite. I mean, you could get quite violent, but you couldn't do that game today. It wouldn't be allowed. But we were quite happy doing all these sort of physical things where we engaged with each other. As youth today, they are more involved in sort of technology. They are involved in how they engage with one another differently. And so a youth group is not going to look like the youth group used to, because that's not what the youth are into today. And so we've got to forget the former things in the sense of we need to not think this worked once in the past, so therefore God has to do it the same way again. This is what it used to be, so this is what it needs to be now. That's what we need to get our heads around. But even in the new thing, it's the same God, the God who allowed it to work. The same God is going to make it work again. And so that's the start of it. And so to move on to the next bit, and we've sort of started touching on the new thing as well. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. God is telling the people of Israel that he is doing a new thing. And it was happening around them. And yet they could not see it. They weren't seeing that God was preparing his plan. He was making a way that was in his purposes. He was going to be bringing them back from Babylon. He was going to be saving his people with the future Messiah too. And yet they could not see that God was at work. They were hemmed in. Their present sufferings would have been part of that, but also maybe because they were thinking of the past. They had Moses, they had a great leader, they had the plagues, they had all this going on around them in Egypt, which they remember in the stories, and they weren't seeing that happen in that moment. They weren't seeing these great things, and so they could not perceive that God was doing a new thing. And so they were expecting the wrong thing from God. They weren't wanting, well, maybe they weren't wanting to see God do a new thing. And it meant, they could not see their God as at work. And it's like for us a lot today. So often we can't allow ourselves to see God at work. Maybe sometimes we think, this isn't going well. This isn't going brilliantly. We're wanting the instant results. And yet we send, why is God not working in what we're doing? Why is God not in our midst? And yet God will be at work. He'll be preparing the ground. There'll be little shoots of God's blessing that we can see in amongst us in our stories. And that's what we need to see, because we end up being like Israel here, where we don't see God at work in us because we allow what is going on around us to consume us. We allow what is going on and those things of the past to consume us because we are holding on. And so we do not see. We expect God to work in a certain way because that is our experience. And we don't allow God to work in another way because it's what our comfort zone is, because we want to limit who God is, how God works, and the way that he wants to save his people, we want to limit to ourselves. And in some ways, in this passage, we start to see an example of God doing a new thing, because it says, I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. If the people of Israel were expecting God to work in the way that has gone before them with the Exodus, then we see almost the opposite happen, where God made the sea turn into dry ground by splitting the sea so they could walk across. Where the ground was wet, they could walk across the dry ground and get into the wilderness and be saved. And yet here, God is saying, I'm going to turn the dry ground and bring streams of water to refresh you. It's when they're thinking about the Exodus, it's almost God saying, look, I'm almost going to do the opposite to what you're expecting here. God is doing a new thing, and it's right there in that passage. And this call to the fact that God is doing a new thing, it is a call to have faith in God. He is at work. He is going to save his people. There may not seem like a way forward, but have faith that God has a plan. Have faith that he is going to make it happen. He made promises to Israel all those years ago. He's going to preserve Israel. He's going to preserve a remnant, and he's going to save you, because that is what he's promising. So have faith that he is going to do it, that God is doing a new thing. You may not perceive it yet, but have faith that he is at work. And that's also true for us today, because God is still at work. God still has a plan. We still have the promises of God of salvation in Jesus Christ, that Jesus is going to return and his kingdom shall reign where there'll be no more death, no more suffering. That is all in the promises of God. He has a plan, and he has a plan to bring people into his kingdom as well. He has made a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. And we know that because that is the work of Jesus Christ on the cross. He has made a way in our sort of spiritual wilderness, in our spiritual wasteland. He has made it possible for us to be restored, to be refreshed, and to find a way to God and the kingdom of heaven. And specifically for us as a church, as we mentioned at the start, we are entering into this season of transition. We are about to, formally launch into this new season with a new vision. And we believe this new vision that we've got, that we are to be a Christian community with a heart for God, seeking God, serving others, and shining brightly. We believe that this vision is a vision which we have received from God, that God is calling us to. And so, during this season of transition, we should be expecting God to do a new thing. We should be trusting that he is going to be at work through whatever it is we do as we strive towards this new vision, this new thing. We may not necessarily see where this is going to come from. We may at times feel a bit defeated. How do we may feel defeated before we start. How do we reverse the tide of what we see across the land in the church? There are lots of barriers that we may perceive before how we may get to where this vision is going. How do we overcome them? And that's again where embracing change with faith comes in. We trust that God will bless what we do. We trust that God is going to go ahead of us and prepare the ground. And that as we seek to move towards our vision, that God is going to prepare the way already, that he is already watering the dry land. We trust that God is already preparing the vision, that God is already making this vision happen. We are just moving into the work of God that he is already doing. That is the trust that we've got. And though the road may sometimes be rocky on this journey, we trust that God is going to be at work. He's going to make it happen. He's going to bring about fruit for his purpose, for the gospel. We may not always like what we do, but we trust that we have a God who is all-powerful. We have a God who knows all things, and that he is going to make his vision happen regardless of our own insufficiencies here. God is at work, and we've got to trust that, and he is going to be doing a new thing for us today. And so we need to forget the former things, and we need to embrace the new. So often we hold on to the things that have been and expect God to work in the same way again. And also we often do something new, and because it's different, we don't allow ourselves to see God at work in it. We approach it anxiously and defensively. We find ourselves thinking, oh, I wouldn't do it that way, so I'm going to have a problem with that. Or, oh, we haven't done it this way in the past. We've always, I don't know, I'm not saying this is what we're going to do, but we've always had the worship group over there, and so they must be there because that's how it works. Maybe that's not what God's calling it. That's not at all in any plan at all at the moment. So don't be thinking, oh, John's got a radical plan to move the music group. But we'll get that into mind. We think things have to stay the same because that is how it's always has been. And we think that God will only do it again if we keep it that way. But that is not how it works. That is not how God works. And actually one of the worst phrases you'll ever hear in church, and actually I must say it's not really been used too often here, is the phrase, we have always done it this way. Oh, it's such a terrible phrase. It's just said so often in churches because it's nice that you've always done it that way, but why? Like often the question is why? Why does it matter that we've always done it that way? And so often there isn't really an answer other than it's just how it's done, because we think that's just how it's meant to be done. That's what we're comfortable with. And as we look to do new things, we need to kind of get out of a mindset of this is how we do it. We're at St. Michael's. This is how we do things. Isn't really going to be a good way forward if we're going to be living as faithful people as we go through change. Yes, we should sometimes challenge things as we go to do it, because we're not just blindly accepting. We may sometimes think this is the right thing to do when it's not the right thing to do, which is why we need to seek God. But actually, we're wanting to do what God is calling us to do. If he asks us to turn the church to the other direction, then we should turn the church and face the other direction. That's just being obedient to God. And so we need to get into our heads that let's be faithful. Let's accept that there may sometimes be changes. There may sometimes be things we're not so comfortable with. But actually, it's okay because we want to do this for God. We want to do this for the gospel. And a great story is, this is actually about Easter in West Brom, where I imagine it's also tradition here. Tradition is you always have communion in the principal Easter service on Easter Day, because that's partly it. There is some church rules about you should have communion on Easter Day, and it's just a tradition that we've always had. But we were doing a mission week during Holy Week, reaching out to the community. And if you know West Brom at all, it's a really diverse community. Like the church school, which was part of the church, their intake, the white British community were probably the minority in the school, because it was full of, you had Eastern Europeans, you had Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, all going to the school. And so that was the sort of demographic that we had. And we were reaching these people and we were inviting them to join us on the Sunday. Join us as we celebrate Easter, and join us as we put on a meal for everybody. We called it Feast of All Nations. We're having food from all the nations that represented the people there, and they were to bring their own sort of cultural foods. We had Jamaican foods, we had Indian food, Scottish food, English foods, foods from all over the world, Eastern European foods. Like literally there was food from all over. It was an amazing day. But to celebrate this, we opted to not have the communion in the principal service, because we were inviting all these people, and we had Muslims turning up, we had Sikhs and Hindus turning up, and certainly in the Sikh culture, hospitality is a huge thing. And if you ever go to a Gurdwara, they will offer you food. There's always food available. And so for us inviting them in with their culture, if we were to then say, no, you cannot come and take communion because you're not a Christian, that would have been highly offensive, and it would have been a complete barrier to the gospel for them. And so we said, we're not going to have communion. We had only a very small handful, thankfully, a very small handful of people who sort of protested this decision, because we should be having communion on Easter. That is how we've always done it. It was literally the phrase that they used. And yet there were others, and actually some of them are really surprising people who you thought might be the people who would have a problem, because they were the more traditional people in the church. But they came up to us and they were just like, is it right we're not having a communion on Easter Sunday? And so I said yes, expecting to get a bit of a moan. And they were like, okay, that's good, because we're having all these people coming and it's for the gospel. And we want them to hear the gospel and come to Christ. And I was like, oh, that's wonderful. And these people, they just accepted it. And we had a really good day. And we had, from Easter week in our church, so we joined with what's called Asian Calvary Church, which met in our church building as well. But in our church specifically, we had 3 new members of the church come through, become Christians because of all the work on Mission Week and what happened there. And then the Asian Calvary Church had even more people come to faith, and a lot more from the Sikh and Hindu background, because that was their main sort of demographic as well. But they accepted a change. It was an uncomfortable change for quite a few people in the church, but they accepted it for the gospel. And that's what we need to be doing as a church as we look to embrace change. We need to accept it for the gospel, because we want to reach as many people as we can in the community of Norton. We want to see God at work in our midst, in our church and in Norton. And it's going to look different to what it has done in the past. That's just a reality that we live in. That is the being in a 21st century life. In reality, it's going to look different. And so we need to have that in mind. And whilst I'm saying all this, like, yes, we need to accept change. Yes, we need to embrace it. It is worth acknowledging that not every change will always work. We are human after all. Yes, we're seeking after God, but we will make mistakes. And that's another thing we need to, as we embrace change, accept that maybe sometimes we will get it wrong. And just because we get it wrong doesn't mean it's a complete disaster. It doesn't mean that it's all a complete failure. We learn, we move on. That's the sake of embracing change. But what we do, even if we get it wrong, we seek to change and do new things under the guidance of God. And we trust that God will use whatever we do. Even if we get it wrong, we trust that God will use it, because that is how God works. He uses people all the time who get things wrong. Some of the best evangelists you'll see out there have been some of the greatest sinners. That's the reality of who our God is. And if you want to find biblical examples, the Bible's full of biblical examples of sinners who God has used. Go through the book of Judges, read about all the judges, see how many failings that they have, and yet God still used them and brought about peace in the land of Israel. Look at the kings of Israel. God used the kings of Israel, and so many of them got things wrong. And there's a whole list where it's and he was a bad king, and yet God still used them for his purposes, used them for a time. And God will use our own mistakes as well. So we need to not get caught up on mistakes and things going wrong. But when things aren't right, we need to acknowledge it, accept it, and then we must be ready for another new thing. We can't just say, we got this wrong, this hasn't worked, that's it, no more. We're going back to what we know, going back to where we've come from. And again, being in churches where they tried something, 20 years ago, and it didn't really work. And so they're like, no, it didn't work, we can't do that. So I think it was a toddler group. But they're like, it didn't work, we're not going to do it again. And it's just but it might be the right time now to do it. We're not going to do exactly how you tried to do it 20 years ago. And so sometimes, actually, we need to just accept something hasn't worked. We try again. And God may bless it. And we do it all through prayer and trust in God. And really, this is where embracing change with faith really comes in. Rather than maybe expecting something not to work, rather than maybe being anxious about it not working, we trust in God. Trust that God has a plan. Trust that he will move in power and that it is God himself that is doing a new thing and that he will do the work. We need to not be caught up in the methods. We need to be trusting the one who is doing the work, which is God himself. We so often think it's about what we do, when the reality is it's about the one who's doing it. It's about the God who reigns supreme over all. It's about him and him alone. And so that's where this embracing change with faith comes in. We trust in God. And it's also worth acknowledging as well that it may not be in that instant that we see the fruit of the work either. Israel, as we see, had to wait. They had this promise in Isaiah 43, and yet it was years later when they were brought out of Babylon. And it was then hundreds of years later, even hundreds of years later, when Jesus came to fulfill the further promises that we see in Isaiah. We sometimes, it's certainly the case for today in our society, we want things instantly. We can get our deliveries next day, even same day sometimes nowadays. We want it instantly, and yet sometimes the fruit of the work is going to take time. And if people took the approach of we need it instantly, and if we don't see it instantly, then we stop. Then things like Christians Against Poverty, the great work that they do up and down the country, if the guy who set that up stopped on this because nobody turned up the first time, then we wouldn't have such a great ministry which has brought so many people out of debt and so many people to Christ. We need to just accept that sometimes things will take time. And sometimes we may never see the fruit of the work that we do. That fruit may come years down the line. And so we've just got to, if we believe this is what God is calling us to, we must just act faithfully, be obedient to him, and trust that he will work, whatever that may be. And so we are to be patient. We are to have faith. And we are to perceive where God is at work, even if it's not obvious, even if it is different to what we've experienced before in the past. Whatever happens, whatever goes ahead of us, have faith. Have faith in God. He is the one who we are looking towards. He is the one who has done all these great things in the past. He is the one who has brought great blessings throughout history. and he is the one who's going to bring new blessings once again. If you ever read the revivals, almost every revival, there are some similarities across them, but they're all so different as well. And so God is going to work, and we need to have faith in him. Faith that he is the one who reigns above it all. Faith that he is the one who promises to bring people into his kingdom, to change hearts. Faith that he is the one who transforms society. Faith that he is the one who loves us. He is the one who is calling us into this new vision. Let's have faith in him. Forget the former things and see that he is doing a new thing. Let us trust him and him alone, because he is good and he has a plan. So let us walk in his plan, in his ways, trusting him with all our hearts, with all our minds, and let us embrace change with faith. Amen.
Let us take a moment to receive that word, to have faith.